You know what they don't tell you in the Galactic Academy's interspecies relations course? They don't mention that humans are absolutely, categorically, unequivocally insane. Oh sure, Professor Zixtal covered all the basics with his usual dry academic precision. Humans are a relatively young species. He'd droned through his vocal synthesizer. They've only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last 50 standard years. Bipedal, carbon-based, average intelligence, prone to emotional outbursts. What he didn't mention, and what I really could have used a heads-up about, was that when you corner a human, when you push them past their breaking point, when you make them genuinely angry, well, that's when you discover that evolution apparently decided to pack the survival instincts of a rabid honey badger into a species clever enough to build starships. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the beginning, when I still thought I understood the universe and my place in it. My name is Keth'var of the Third Spiral, and up until 3 cycles ago, I was just another mid-level communications officer aboard the GCS Harmony's Dream, one of those massive multi-species diplomatic vessels that the Galactic Council loves to parade around as proof that we've all evolved beyond our primitive territorial phase. You know, the kind of ship where the Velnari handle navigation because they can see in 17 different spectrums. The Thoraxians manage engineering because they can survive in basically any environment. And species like mine, the Keth'var, handle communications because we're naturally empathic and supposedly good at keeping everyone from killing each other. Supposedly being the operative term there. I should probably explain what we Keth'var look like, in case you're imagining something dramatically different. Picture a 7-foot-tall cross between a praying mantis and a very polite sociology professor. We've got 4 arms, great for multitasking, large compound eyes, excellent for reading micro-expressions across species, and a generally calm, measured approach to conflict resolution that has served us well in our role as the galaxy's designated mediators. We're proud of that role, actually. For the past 3,000 years, the Keth'var have been the ones called in when negotiations break down, when trade disputes escalate, when entire star systems start rattling their sabers at each other. We talk things through. We find common ground. We make everyone feel heard and validated, and then we craft elegant solutions that leave all parties feeling like they've won something. It's civilized. It's evolved. It's how intelligent species are supposed to handle their differences. And it works beautifully. Right up until you encounter a species that looks at your carefully crafted diplomatic solution and says, "Yeah, that's nice, but we're going with Plan B." "What's Plan B?" you ask. "Violence," they reply, with the kind of cheerful enthusiasm most species reserve for discussing their favorite recreational activities. That's humans for you. The day everything went sideways started out routine enough. We were stationed in the Kepler 442 system, mediating what should have been a straightforward territorial dispute between the Zephyrian Trade Consortium and a relatively new human colony called New Terra. The humans had settled on a planet that the Zephyrians claimed was within their traditional trade routes, and both sides were getting increasingly snippy about it. Snippy is actually putting it mildly. The Zephyrians, who look like 8-foot-tall cross between a shark and an accountant, and have all the charm you'd expect from that combination, had been making increasingly aggressive demands for the humans to relocate. The humans, meanwhile, had responded to these demands with what I can only describe as creative and anatomically impossible suggestions about what the Zephyrians could do with their traditional trade routes. So there I was, doing what I do best, sitting in a conference room aboard the Harmony's Dream, facilitating dialogue between species who would rather be shooting at each other. The Zephyrian delegation was led by War Admiral Thexka, a particularly unpleasant specimen who had the unfortunate habit of displaying his razor-sharp teeth every time he disagreed with something. The human delegation consisted of exactly one person, Commander Tyler Brooks, colonial administrator and, as I would soon learn, a walking example of why humans have survived everything the universe has thrown at them despite having no natural weapons, armor, or apparent sense of self-preservation. Commander Brooks looked, well, human. Medium height, brown hair going gray at the temples, the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent significant time under alien suns. He wore a simple blue uniform with minimal decorations, no ceremonial weapons, no impressive rank insignia, nothing to indicate that he represented a species anyone should take seriously. The Zephyrians, on the other hand, had shown up in full military regalia, complete with energy weapons that were technically legal under the Galactic Peace Accords, but were definitely pushing the boundaries of what constituted defensive armament. "The solution is obvious," War Admiral Thexka was saying, his teeth glinting in the artificial light. "The humans will relocate their colony to a system that does not interfere with established Zephyrian interests." We are prepared to offer compensation equal to their initial investment, plus 15% for the inconvenience. I turned to Commander Brooks, expecting the usual human bluster and negotiation. Commander, would you like to respond to this proposal? Brooks leaned back in his chair, and I swear I saw the ghost of a smile cross his face. Sure, War Admiral. With all due respect, you can take your compensation and shove it where your homestar doesn't shine. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. War Admiral Thexka's teeth were now fully displayed in what was definitely not a smile. Perhaps, I interjected quickly, we could explore alternative solutions. Commander Brooks, I understand your colony has invested significant resources in terraforming operations. Could you explain the specific challenges that relocation would present? The challenges? Brooks scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, Keth'var, the main challenge is that we don't want to. See, we've got about 50,000 people down there who've spent the last 5 years turning a barely habitable rock into something resembling home. They've got farms, schools, businesses, families. The idea of packing all that up and moving because some overgrown spacefish thinks he owns that particular patch of vacuum doesn't sit real well with us. I felt my secondary heart skip a beat. In my extensive experience with interspecies diplomacy, referring to a Zephyrian war admiral as an overgrown spacefish was what we in the business call counterproductive to peaceful resolution. War Admiral Thexka's response was predictable. You dare! Oh, I dare! Brooks interrupted, and there was something in his voice that made me sit up straighter. I dare, because you waltzed in here acting like you own that system, when the reality is that your traditional trade routes consist of passing through the outer edge of the system maybe once every few years. You've never settled there, never developed anything there, never had any permanent presence there at all. But suddenly, when humans show up and start actually using the place, it becomes sacred Zephyrian territory. The Zephyrian Trade Consortium has navigated those routes for 300 years, according to your own records, Brooks said. You know what my species calls 300 years? Last Tuesday. We've got individual humans who've been alive longer than your entire trade relationship with that system. This was not going well. I could feel the tension in the room rising like water in a leaking spacecraft, and my empathic senses were practically screaming warnings at me. Gentlemen, perhaps we could— What your species calls irrelevant, War Admiral Thexka snarled. Considering that you have existed in galactic society for barely 50 standard years. The Zephyrian Trade Consortium was establishing interstellar commerce when your ancestors were still confined to your birth world. And yet, Brooks said mildly, here we are, having this conversation. Funny how that works. I was starting to understand why humans had such a complicated reputation in galactic politics. They had this absolutely infuriating habit of being technically correct while simultaneously being diplomatically catastrophic. Commander Brooks, I tried again. Surely you can understand the War Admiral's position. The Zephyrians have established legal precedent. Legal precedent, Brooks repeated. Right. Based on a legal framework that humans weren't part of when it was created, governing territory that nobody was using, enforced by an organization that didn't even know we existed until 5 minutes ago in galactic terms. He looked directly at War Admiral Thexka. Tell me, War Admiral, what exactly did the Zephyrian Trade Consortium contribute to the development of the Kepler 442 system prior to human arrival? The silence stretched uncomfortably. War Admiral Thexka's mandibles. Wait, no. Zephyrians don't have mandibles. They have some sort of jaw appendage that I can never remember the proper term for. Anyway, his facial features were doing things that I'd learned to recognize as signs of mounting rage. Contribution is irrelevant, he finally said. Legal claim supersedes development. Ah, Brooks nodded. So you're saying that doing absolutely nothing for 3 centuries creates a stronger legal claim than actually building a functioning society. Interesting legal theory. Does that work for personal property too? Because I've got my eye on your ship, and I've been not using it for my entire life. That's when War Admiral Thexka made what I would later recognize as a critical error in judgment. He reached for his ceremonial weapon. Now, to be fair to the War Admiral, he probably wasn't actually planning to use it. Zephyrians are big on intimidation displays, and the gesture was likely meant to remind everyone in the room that his species had been conquering star systems when humans were still figuring out agriculture. It was a power play, pure and simple. But here's the thing about humans that nobody tells you in the Academy. They don't actually distinguish between intimidation displays and genuine threats. To a human, if you reach for a weapon during an argument, you've just escalated the situation from diplomatic disagreement to fight for survival. And humans, as I was about to learn, take fighting for survival very seriously indeed. Brooks didn't even seem to think about it. One moment he was sitting casually in his chair. The next he was moving faster than my compound eyes could track. The ceremonial weapon went spinning across the room. War Admiral Thexka found himself face down on the conference table with his arm twisted behind his back, and Commander Brooks was speaking in a voice so calm and conversational that it took me several seconds to process the words. Now, War Admiral, I'm going to let you up, and you're going to sit back down, and we're going to continue this conversation like civilized beings. And if you reach for another weapon, I'm going to assume you're trying to kill me and react accordingly. Are we clear? War Admiral Thexka, his dignity somewhat compromised by having his face pressed against the conference table, managed to grunt what might have been agreement. Brooks released him and stepped back, but I noticed he stayed on his feet, ready to move again if necessary. Excellent, Brooks said brightly. Now where were we? I stared at him. This human had just physically subdued a Zephyrian war admiral, a member of one of the galaxy's most militaristic species, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And now he was acting like nothing had happened. Commander, I said carefully, perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow everyone to compose themselves. Good idea, Brooks agreed. War Admiral, do you need a few minutes? War Admiral Thexka straightened his uniform with as much dignity as he could muster, which wasn't much. This is not over, human. Probably not, Brooks acknowledged cheerfully. But hey, at least we're making progress. 10 minutes ago you were threatening my people with forced relocation. Now you're just threatening me personally. I call that an improvement. During the recess, I found myself alone with Commander Brooks in the corridor outside the conference room. My diplomatic training told me I should be focusing on damage control, figuring out how to salvage the negotiations after that spectacularly inappropriate display of violence. My personal curiosity, however, was focused on something else entirely. Commander, I said, I have to ask, how did you move that fast? Zephyrians have significantly faster reflexes than most species, and War Admiral Thexka is an experienced military officer. The odds of a human successfully subduing him in close quarters should be basically zero, Brooks suggested. Yeah, I get that a lot. The thing is, Keth'var, your calculations are probably based on the assumption that this was a fair fight between two military professionals. Wasn't it? Brooks laughed, and there was something in that laugh that made my exoskeleton itch. Not even close. See, the War Admiral was thinking about this as a diplomatic incident with military implications. He was calculating political consequences, legal ramifications, the effect on his reputation if he killed or injured a diplomatic envoy. And you weren't? Hell no. The moment he reached for that weapon, I stopped thinking about politics entirely. I started thinking about the 50,000 people on New Terra who are counting on me to keep them safe. And when a human starts thinking that way, well, let's just say that higher brain functions take a back seat to some very old, very practical survival instincts. I studied his face, trying to read the emotions there. Humans were notoriously difficult for Keth'var to interpret. Their emotional states seemed to shift and blend in ways that defied our usual empathic abilities. You're not afraid of him, I realized. You're not afraid of the Zephyrian military, or the political consequences, or any of it. Oh, I'm terrified, Brooks said casually. Absolutely scared out of my mind. The Zephyrians could glass our entire colony from orbit, and there wouldn't be a damn thing we could do to stop them. Their ships are faster, their weapons are more advanced, their military has been perfecting the art of conquest for millennia. But being afraid and being helpless aren't the same thing, he continued. Fear can be useful if you don't let it paralyze you. It keeps you alert, keeps you thinking, keeps you looking for options that maybe nobody else has considered. What options? Brooks smiled, and this time there was definitely something unsettling about it. Well, that's the question, isn't it? What does a young, technologically inferior species do when faced with an older, more powerful enemy that wants them gone? I thought about it. In my experience, the answer was usually negotiate a compromise, or find a more powerful ally, or relocate to avoid conflict. I have no idea, I admitted. Neither did I, Brooks said. But you know what I realized during that little scuffle in there? War Admiral Thexka is strong, fast, and well-trained. But he's also predictable. He's fighting the way he was taught to fight, using tactics that worked against enemies who followed the same basic rules he does. And humans don't? Humans don't follow any rules when their families are threatened, Brooks said. We've got this unfortunate habit of improvising. The negotiations resumed with War Admiral Thexka looking considerably less confident than before. I tried to restart the discussion along more traditional diplomatic lines, but it was clear that the dynamic in the room had fundamentally changed. Perhaps, I suggested. We could explore a time-sharing arrangement. The Zephyrian Trade Consortium could maintain their traditional routes, while the human colony continues to develop the planet's resources. With proper coordination, both parties could benefit from— Unacceptable, War Admiral Thexka interrupted. The humans will relocate, or they will be removed. Commander Brooks leaned forward slightly. War Admiral, I'm curious. How many ships do you currently have in this system? The question seemed to catch the Zephyrian off guard. That is, why do you ask? Just making conversation. See, my people have this saying, know your enemy. And right now, I'm trying to figure out whether you're speaking from a position of strength or whether you're bluffing. The Zephyrian Trade Consortium maintains sufficient military assets to enforce our territorial claims, War Admiral Thexka said stiffly. That's not really an answer, Brooks pointed out. But that's okay. I already know the answer. You've got 3 cruisers and a dreadnought currently positioned at the edge of the system. Impressive firepower. Certainly enough to level our colony if you're willing to commit genocide to make your point. I felt my secondary stomachs clench. If Brooks was right about the Zephyrian fleet composition, then this negotiation was essentially pointless. The humans were completely outgunned. However, Brooks continued, I noticed that your ships are staying well outside the planet's gravity well. Why is that, do you think? War Admiral Thexka's expression was unreadable, but I caught a slight stiffening in his posture that suggested Brooks had hit on something significant. Standard tactical positioning, the War Admiral said. Really? Because it looks to me like you're afraid to get too close to our little colony. And that makes me wonder what exactly you're afraid of. The Zephyrian military fears nothing from a primitive human settlement. Primitive, Brooks mused. You know, War Admiral, you keep using that word, but I don't think you really understand what it means. See, when most species talk about primitive technology, they're thinking about efficiency, elegance, sophistication. They're comparing power sources and computational systems and manufacturing techniques. He stood up and began pacing around the room, his hands clasped behind his back like a professor delivering a lecture. But humans learned a long time ago that the most sophisticated technology isn't always the most effective technology. Sometimes, the primitive solution is the one that works when everything else fails. Your point being? War Admiral Thexka asked. My point is that your dreadnought, for all its advanced shields and weapon systems, is a very large, very complex, very expensive piece of equipment. And complex systems have a tendency to fail in unexpected ways when subjected to unexpected stresses. I was starting to get a very bad feeling about where this conversation was heading. Are you threatening Zephyrian military assets? War Admiral Thexka demanded. Not at all, Brooks said innocently. I'm just observing that your ships seem reluctant to enter the inner system. And I'm wondering if that has anything to do with the rumors about what happened to the Corinth Navy when they tried to blockade Earth about 20 years ago. The silence in the room was deafening. I'd heard rumors about the Corinth incident, but the details had always been classified. All I knew was that a powerful alien fleet had arrived at Earth to enforce some sort of trade agreement and had subsequently left. Quickly, without accomplishing their objectives. The Corinth situation was unique, War Admiral Thexka said carefully. Unique how? The details are classified under galactic security protocols. Brooks nodded thoughtfully. Classified. Right. Well, War Admiral, here's the thing about humans and classified information. We have this terrible habit of talking among ourselves. So while the official records might be sealed, the stories tend to get around. He stopped pacing and looked directly at the Zephyrian. Would you like to hear the story I heard? War Admiral Thexka said nothing, but his facial features were doing that thing again that indicated mounting stress. The way I heard it, Brooks continued, the Corinth Navy showed up at Earth with a significant fleet. Nothing as impressive as yours, but still substantial. They demanded that Earth comply with some new trade regulations that would have basically turned us into a client species. Earth's response was creative. See, the Corinth had made the same assumption you're making, that a young species with primitive technology couldn't possibly threaten ships that had been built by a civilization with thousands of years of spacefaring experience. And they were wrong? Brooks smiled that unsettling smile again. Oh, they were catastrophically wrong. Because while they were focused on our military capabilities, they completely overlooked our industrial capabilities, specifically our asteroid mining operations. I felt a chill run down my spine. Commander, I'm not suggesting anything, Brooks said. I'm just telling a story. See, the Corinth blockade was positioned pretty much where your fleet is now, far enough out to avoid any planetary defenses, close enough to threaten orbital bombardment. Standard naval tactics. What they didn't account for was that Earth's mining operations had been moving asteroids around the system for decades. We'd gotten pretty good at it, actually. Precision trajectory calculations, ion drives capable of moving millions of tons of rock, that sort of thing. War Admiral Thexka was now visibly uncomfortable. The Corinth incident involved no asteroid impacts. Oh, you're absolutely right, Brooks agreed. No impacts at all. But there were some very near misses. Turns out that when you're sitting in a spaceship watching a mountain-sized chunk of rock bearing down on you at significant velocity, the philosophical distinction between deliberate attack and mining accident becomes somewhat academic. You wouldn't dare, wouldn't I? Brooks asked mildly. War Admiral, let me ask you something. How much do you think your dreadnought costs to build? That's classified information. Fair enough. But I'm guessing it's somewhere in the range of several billion credits, represents decades of advanced research and development, and is basically irreplaceable if something unfortunate were to happen to it. Your point? My point is that a nickel-iron asteroid roughly the size of a city block costs about 50 credits worth of fuel to redirect. And while your shields are probably capable of deflecting energy weapons and high-velocity projectiles, they weren't really designed to stop something with the mass of a small moon moving at orbital velocity. The temperature in the room seemed to have dropped to near freezing. War Admiral Thexka was staring at Brooks like he was looking at some sort of particularly venomous predator. You're talking about using asteroids as weapons, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That's completely insane, is it? Brooks asked. I mean, it's certainly unconventional, and I'll grant you that the trajectory calculations are pretty complex. But insane? War Admiral, what would you call sending a dreadnought to threaten 50,000 civilians because they're living on a planet you've never even visited? We are enforcing legitimate territorial claims. And we're defending our homes. The question is, who's willing to go further to achieve their objectives? I realized that I was watching something I'd never seen before in all my years of diplomatic service. A negotiation where one side was completely outgunned, completely outnumbered, and completely outclassed, and yet somehow held all the cards. The Galactic Council would never permit the use of asteroids as weapons, War Admiral Thexka said, but his voice lacked conviction. Permit? Brooks laughed. War Admiral, the Galactic Council doesn't even have jurisdiction over asteroid mining operations. And even if they did, how exactly would they stop us? Send another fleet? Because I have to tell you, we've got a lot of asteroids. This is madness. No, Brooks said, and suddenly his voice was completely serious. Madness would be starting a war that nobody wins. Madness would be glassing a planet full of civilians to enforce a territorial claim based on 300-year-old trade routes. Madness would be assuming that just because we're young and primitive, we're also helpless. He sat back down, and when he spoke again, his tone was conversational once more. Here's what I think, War Admiral. I think you came here expecting to intimidate a bunch of backward colonists into packing up and leaving. I think you figured that a show of force would be enough to convince us that resistance was futile. And I think you're starting to realize that humans don't actually have a resistance is futile setting. What happened next was something I'd never witnessed in decades of diplomatic service. A war admiral of the Zephyrian Trade Consortium backing down from a clearly inferior opponent. Oh, he didn't call it backing down, of course. He called it reassessing the strategic situation and considering alternative approaches to territorial resolution. But the end result was the same. Within 2 hours, the Zephyrian fleet had withdrawn to the outer edge of the system, and War Admiral Thexka was suddenly very interested in exploring compromise solutions. The final agreement was actually quite reasonable. The Zephyrian Trade Consortium retained navigation rights through the system, while New Terra was recognized as a legitimate human colony with full territorial sovereignty over the planet and its immediate orbital space. Both sides agreed to coordinate their activities to avoid conflicts, and a joint commission was established to handle any future disputes. In other words, exactly the sort of compromise I'd been trying to negotiate from the beginning, but which had only become possible after Commander Brooks had convinced War Admiral Thexka that the alternative to compromise was having his expensive warships dodging mining equipment that had been accidentally redirected by a species with a poor understanding of proper space traffic control. As the Zephyrian delegation prepared to depart, War Admiral Thexka pulled me aside for a private conversation. Keth'var, he said, I want you to understand something. The Zephyrian Trade Consortium is not afraid of human military capabilities. Our ships are faster, our weapons more powerful, our tactics more sophisticated. Of course, War Admiral. But that human... He gestured toward Commander Brooks, who was chatting amicably with one of my junior diplomats. He wasn't thinking like a military officer. He wasn't calculating acceptable casualties or strategic objectives or political ramifications. What was he thinking like? War Admiral Thexka was quiet for a long moment. Like a prey animal that's decided to stop running, he said finally. Do you understand the difference? I thought I did, but I wasn't sure I wanted to. A military officer fights to win, the war admiral continued. A prey animal that stopped running fights to make sure that even if it dies, whatever killed it regrets the experience. And that human, he wasn't planning to win Keth'var. He was planning to make victory so expensive that we'd decide it wasn't worth the cost. And you think he would have actually done it? Weaponized asteroids against your fleet? I think, War Admiral Thexka said carefully, that he would have done whatever was necessary to protect his people. And I think that for humans, whatever is necessary includes options that most species wouldn't even consider. He paused at the airlock leading to his shuttle. Keth'var, I've been fighting wars for 300 years. I've commanded fleets against the Corvanth hegemony, the Stellar Dominion, and a dozen other powers. I understand military strategy, tactical superiority, and the calculated application of force. But I've never fought an enemy that was willing to drop mountains on my head just to make a point. And I hope I never have to. After the Zephyrians departed, I found myself alone with Commander Brooks in the observation lounge, watching the distant stars and trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Commander, I said finally, I have to ask, would you really have done it? If negotiations had failed, if the Zephyrians had proceeded with their threats, would you actually have used asteroids as weapons? Brooks considered the question for a long moment, staring out at the stars. You know, Keth'var, that's the beautiful thing about deterrence, he said eventually. It only works if your enemy believes you'd follow through. But it only works ethically if you never actually have to find out whether you would. That's not an answer. Sure it is. It's just not the answer you were looking for. He turned away from the viewport and looked at me directly. Let me tell you something about humans, Keth'var. We're not the strongest species in the galaxy, or the fastest, or the smartest. We don't have the best technology, the biggest ships, or the most sophisticated weapons. But we've got one advantage that seems to consistently surprise everyone we encounter. Which is? We're very, very good at surviving. And over the millennia, we've learned that sometimes the best way to survive is to convince potential threats that killing you would be more trouble than it's worth. He smiled that unsettling smile again. The thing about being the new species in galactic politics is that everyone assumes they understand your capabilities and limitations. They look at our ships, our weapons, our military doctrine, and they calculate that we're not a significant threat. What they don't calculate is that human survival strategies aren't based on military doctrine. They're based on 10,000 years of being the weakest predator on a planet full of things that could kill us without breaking a sweat. And what did that teach you? That if you can't be the biggest, or the strongest, or the fastest, you'd better be the most unpredictable. And if you can't win a fight, you'd better make sure the other guy understands that even if he wins, he's going to lose something he can't afford to replace. I thought about that for a while, watching the stars and trying to reconcile the mild-mannered colonial administrator in front of me with the person who had just deterred a Zephyrian dreadnought with mining equipment and creative trajectory calculations. Commander, I said eventually, there's something I don't understand. If humans are so good at this kind of creative problem-solving, why do you need species like mine? Why engage with galactic diplomacy at all? Brooks laughed, and this time it was a genuinely warm sound. Because Keth'var, survival isn't the same thing as living. Yes, we're good at convincing people not to kill us, but we'd much rather find ways to coexist peacefully. The thing is, peace requires trust, and trust requires communication, and communication between species as different as humans and Zephyrians. Well, that's where species like yours become invaluable. I'm not sure I follow. You've spent millions of years learning how to bridge differences between species, how to find common ground, how to translate not just languages, but entire ways of thinking. That's not a skill humans have developed, because until very recently, we only had to communicate with other humans. He gestured toward the viewport, where the Harmony's Dream was preparing to jump to its next diplomatic assignment. Today, you helped two species avoid a war that nobody wanted over a conflict that didn't need to happen. You created a framework for cooperation where there had been only suspicion and hostility. But you're the one who convinced War Admiral Thexka to negotiate seriously. I convinced him that the costs of not negotiating were too high, Brooks corrected. But you're the one who showed him how to negotiate in a way that let him save face while giving us what we needed. That's not a human skill, Keth'var. That's something your species has perfected over millennia. So we need each other. We need each other, he agreed. Humans can survive in a hostile galaxy, but we can't build the kind of civilization we want to live in without help from species who understand cooperation better than we do. And species like yours can build frameworks for peace, But sometimes you need species like ours to remind potential aggressors that peace is a better option than the alternatives. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars and contemplating the strange partnership that was apparently developing between our species. "Commander," I said eventually, "there's one more thing I have to ask." "Shoot." "Those asteroid mining operations around Earth, they don't actually exist, do they?" Brooks turned to look at me, and his expression was completely unreadable. "Keth'var," he said solemnly, "that would be classified under human security protocols." Then he grinned. "But I will say this. If you're ever in the Sol system and you see some very large chunks of rock moving in very precise trajectories, you might want to make sure your ship's transponder is broadcasting proper identification codes. And if you happen to be traveling with anyone who might have hostile intentions toward Earth, well, you might want to suggest they reconsider their plans." I stared at him. "You're not going to tell me whether you're serious or not, are you?" "Nope. And that's deliberate. That's the whole point, Keth'var. Deterrence only works if your potential enemies aren't sure what you're capable of." He stood up and stretched, looking entirely too pleased with himself. "Besides," he added, "where's the fun in giving away all our secrets?" 3 cycles later, I'm still serving aboard the Harmony's Dream, and I've had the opportunity to work with several more human diplomatic missions. Each one has been educational. There was the trade dispute in the Centauri sector, where the human negotiator convinced a consortium of merchant princes to accept unfavorable terms by casually mentioning that Earth's agricultural exports included several varieties of plants that were considered highly toxic to most galactic species. And wasn't it interesting how easy it would be for shipping manifests to get mixed up? There was the territorial conflict in the Vega system, where a human colonial representative deterred 3 different species from claiming the same planet by pointing out that humans had a long history of making life unpleasant for occupying forces. And wouldn't it be simpler for everyone involved if they just recognized human sovereignty and moved on to less complicated conquest targets? And there was the incident in the Kepler 186 system, where a human freighter captain convinced a squadron of pirates to leave him alone by explaining that human cargo vessels were equipped with emergency beacon systems that automatically transmitted detailed scans of any attacking ships to a central database that was shared with every human military vessel in the sector. "Nothing personal," he'd told the pirate captain. "But attacking human ships tends to result in other human ships showing up at your home port, asking pointed questions about your business model." The pattern was becoming clear. Humans didn't fight fair. They didn't follow conventional tactical doctrine, and they had an absolutely infuriating tendency to turn their apparent weaknesses into strategic advantages. They were too young to have developed sophisticated military traditions, so they improvised. They were too small to dominate through force, so they relied on unpredictability. They were too inexperienced to understand proper diplomatic protocol, so they ignored it entirely and focused on results. And somehow, impossibly, it was working. The galaxy was learning to take humans seriously. Not because they were powerful in any conventional sense, but because nobody could predict what they might do when pushed. It was like discovering that the new neighbors were completely insane, but in a way that made them surprisingly effective at getting what they wanted. I was thinking about this as I prepared for my latest assignment. Another territorial dispute, this time involving a human research station that had apparently been built in violation of some obscure mining rights treaty. The complainants were the Vorthan Mining Collective, a species that looked like 7-foot-tall lobsters with engineering degrees and attitudes to match. The human representative this time was Dr. Elena Vasquez, a xenobotanist who had been appointed as the station's diplomatic liaison, apparently because she was the only person on the research team who had ever taken a political science course. She was small, soft-spoken, and gave every impression of being completely out of her depth in galactic politics. The Vorthons, on the other hand, had sent mining engineer Prime Keth'var, who arrived with a full technical team and enough legal documentation to build a small space station. His opening position was simple. The human research station was interfering with established Vorthan mining operations and needed to be relocated immediately. "Dr. Vasquez," I said, opening the negotiations with my usual diplomatic phrasing, "would you like to respond to the mining engineer Prime's concerns?" Dr. Vasquez looked up from the tablet she'd been studying, and I noticed that her eyes had the kind of focused intensity that I was beginning to recognize as a dangerous sign in humans. "Actually, Keth'var, I'd like to ask Mining Engineer Prime Keth'var a question first, if that's all right." "Certainly." She turned to face the Vorthan delegation with a polite smile that somehow managed to be deeply unsettling. "Mining Engineer Prime, I've been reviewing your documentation, and I'm curious about something." Your mining rights in this system are based on the presence of rare earth elements in the asteroid belt, correct? That is correct, Keth'var replied, his mechanical voice carrying a note of impatience. The Vorthan Mining Collective has held exclusive extraction rights in this system for over 200 standard years, and you've been actively mining these asteroids for that entire time. Mining operations have been intermittent, based on market conditions and operational requirements. Dr. Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. So, when you say intermittent, what exactly do you mean? Are we talking about seasonal variations, periodic equipment upgrades, what? I could see where this was going, and I was starting to get that familiar feeling of impending diplomatic catastrophe. Market conditions have not always favored active extraction, Keth'var said carefully. I see. And when was the last time you actually conducted mining operations in this system? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Keth'var's mechanical appendages were making subtle clicking sounds that I'd learned to recognize as signs of stress in Vorthans. Approximately 47 standard years ago, he admitted finally. 47 years, Dr. Vasquez repeated. And during those 47 years, has the Vorthan Mining Collective maintained any permanent presence in this system? Any monitoring stations, security outposts, automated systems? Physical presence is not required to maintain legal claim under galactic mining regulations, Section 12, subsection. That's not what I asked, Dr. Vasquez interrupted gently. I asked whether you've maintained any actual presence here. No. So for 47 years, this system has been completely empty except for the occasional automated survey probe? That is technically accurate. Dr. Vasquez smiled that unsettling smile, and I braced myself for whatever was coming next. Mining Engineer Prime, I'm wondering if you're familiar with the ecological survey data from this system. The question seemed to catch the Vorthan off guard. Ecological surveys are not relevant to mining operations, aren't they? Because according to our research, this system contains several species that don't exist anywhere else in the galaxy. Unique evolutionary adaptations, completely novel biochemistry, potential medical applications that could revolutionize treatment for dozens of diseases across multiple species. Your point being? My point is that we're not just running a research station here. We're conducting the first comprehensive study of the most biologically diverse system discovered in the last 2 centuries. And we're doing it for free, sharing all our data with the galactic scientific community under the open research protocols. I felt my stomach sink. The open research protocols were sacred to the Galactic Council. They guaranteed that any scientific discoveries with potential medical applications would be freely available to all member species. That is admirable, Keth'var said slowly. But legal mining rights supersede scientific research under established precedent. Do they? Dr. Vasquez asked. Even when that research might lead to cures for diseases that affect billions of beings across the galaxy? The law is clear. The law is also clear about environmental protection requirements for mining operations, Dr. Vasquez interrupted. Have you filed the required ecological impact assessments for this system? Another uncomfortable silence. Environmental assessments are filed when mining operations commence, Keth'var said. But you can't commence mining operations without completing environmental assessments first. It's a legal requirement under the same regulations you're citing for your mining rights. I realized I was watching another example of humans taking a seemingly hopeless situation and finding an angle that nobody else had considered. The Vorthans had legal mining rights, but they hadn't maintained them properly. They had the right to extract resources, but they couldn't exercise that right without complying with environmental regulations that they'd never bothered to complete. Furthermore, Dr. Vasquez continued, our research has identified 17 different species in this system that meet the criteria for protected status under the Galactic Biodiversity Preservation Act. Mining operations that threaten protected species require special permits, environmental mitigation plans, and approval from the Galactic Council's Environmental Protection Agency, which, she added with that unsettling smile, typically takes about 15 to 20 years to process. Keth'var's mechanical appendages were now clicking rapidly enough to sound like rainfall on metal. You cannot simply declare species protected to interfere with legitimate mining operations. I'm not declaring anything, Dr. Vasquez said innocently. I'm just documenting what we found. The legal classifications are determined by the Galactic Environmental Protection Agency based on established scientific criteria. She pulled out her tablet and began reading from it. Let's see. We've got 3 different species of crystalline organisms that appear to be silicon-based life forms. That's an automatic protected classification right there. We've got a variety of extremophile bacteria that survive in environments that would kill most known life forms. Huge potential for medical research, definitely protected. And then there's the really interesting discovery. Which is? We found evidence of a complex ecosystem that exists entirely in the vacuum of space. Organisms that live and reproduce in the asteroid belt itself, using solar radiation as an energy source and somehow processing raw minerals into biological compounds. She looked up from her tablet. Mining Engineer Prime, are you familiar with the penalty for accidentally exterminating a protected species during mining operations? From the way Keth'var's mechanical systems had suddenly gone completely silent, I gathered that he was indeed familiar with those penalties. Of course, Dr. Vasquez continued cheerfully. If you're willing to wait for the environmental impact assessments to be completed, and the protected species classifications to be finalized, and the special mining permits to be approved, well, I'm sure we can work something out. How long are we talking about? Keth'var asked weakly. Oh, probably only about 20 or 30 years. These things do take time when you're dealing with unique ecosystems and potential medical breakthroughs. 30 years, give or take. But hey, look on the bright side. By then, our research will be complete, and we'll have a much better understanding of how to conduct mining operations without damaging the local ecosystem. We might even be able to provide you with detailed guidance on how to extract your minerals without disrupting the space-dwelling organisms. For a reasonable consulting fee, of course. I stared at her. This quiet little xenobotanist had just turned a clear-cut legal dispute into a bureaucratic nightmare that could tie up the Vorthon Mining Collective for decades. And she was doing it with a smile. Dr. Vasquez, I said carefully, are you suggesting that the Vorthon Mining Collective abandon their legal claims to this system? Not at all, she replied. I'm just pointing out that exercising those claims is going to be significantly more complicated than Mining Engineer Prime Keth'var initially anticipated. However, she continued, there is an alternative approach that might work better for everyone involved. Which is? Joint research venture. The Vorthons provide funding and technical expertise for our research operations, and in exchange, they get exclusive access to any mineral extraction techniques we develop during our ecological studies. Plus, they get first rights to any mineral deposits we identify that can be extracted without environmental damage. And if we refuse? Keth'var asked. Dr. Vasquez shrugged. Then you wait 30 years for the environmental permits, spend millions of credits on impact assessments and legal fees, and hope that the species we've discovered don't turn out to be sentient. Because if they are, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Accidentally exterminating a sentient species was one of the few crimes that could result in expulsion from the Galactic Council entirely. How do we know these species actually exist? Keth'var demanded. How do we know you haven't simply fabricated this data to interfere with our mining rights? Dr. Vasquez's smile widened. Mining Engineer Prime, that's a very good question, and I'm absolutely delighted that you asked it. She touched a control on her tablet, and the conference room's holographic display activated. Suddenly we were looking at what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of the asteroid belt, with thousands of tiny glowing points scattered throughout. What you're seeing here is real-time data from our monitoring satellites, Dr. Vasquez explained. Each of those lights represents a cluster of organisms that we've identified as potential space-dwelling life forms. The display zoomed in on one of the clusters, revealing what looked like a delicate crystalline structure drifting through the vacuum between asteroids. This particular organism appears to be some sort of colonial entity, hundreds of individual units that function as a single organism. They feed on solar radiation and raw minerals from asteroid surfaces, and they reproduce by budding off smaller colonial groups. Impossible, Keth'var said, but his voice lacked conviction. Not impossible, Dr. Vasquez corrected. Just unprecedented, which is exactly why this research is so important. The display shifted to show another organism, this one resembling a vast gossamer web stretched between several asteroids. This one is even more interesting. It appears to be some sort of space-dwelling plant analog. It uses photosynthesis to convert solar energy into complex organic compounds, and it spreads by releasing spores that drift through the asteroid belt until they find suitable anchoring points. And this one? The display shifted again, showing what looked like a swarm of tiny glowing jellyfish drifting through space. This one we think might actually be intelligent. Intelligent? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We've observed coordinated behavior, complex communication patterns, and what appears to be tool use. They manipulate asteroid fragments to build structures that serve no obvious survival purpose, which suggests they might be creating art. The silence in the conference room was absolute. If Dr. Vasquez was right. If there were actually intelligent life forms living in the asteroid belt, then any mining operations that threatened them would be not just illegal, but an act of genocide. Of course, Dr. Vasquez continued casually. We won't know for certain whether they're truly intelligent until we complete our behavioral studies, which should only take another, 15 or 20 years. Unless, of course, we had additional funding and technical support that might allow us to accelerate the research process. I looked at Keth'var, and I could practically see the calculations running through his mechanical brain. 30 years of legal delays and environmental assessments, versus a joint research venture that might give the Vorthons access to mineral extraction techniques that no other species possessed. What exactly would this joint venture entail? He asked finally. Dr. Vasquez's smile was positively radiant. I'm so glad you asked. 2 hours later, I found myself witnessing the signing of one of the most unusual agreements in the history of galactic diplomacy. The Vorthan Mining Collective would provide funding and technical support for the human research station, while the humans would share all their research data and provide the Vorthans with exclusive access to any mineral extraction techniques developed during the project. Both sides got what they wanted. The humans got funding for their research and protection for the unique ecosystem they'd discovered, while the Vorthons got access to potentially revolutionary mining techniques and the exclusive rights to extract any minerals that could be harvested without environmental damage. It was elegant, practical, and mutually beneficial. In other words, exactly the sort of solution that traditional diplomacy was supposed to produce, but which had only become possible after Dr. Vasquez had convinced the Vorthans that their alternatives were much less attractive. As the Vorthan delegation prepared to depart, Keth'var approached me with what I'd learned to recognize as a request for a private conversation. Keth'var, he said, his mechanical voice unusually quiet. I must ask, do those space-dwelling organisms actually exist? I looked across the room at Dr. Vasquez, who was cheerfully discussing research protocols with one of the Vorthan technicians. Mining Engineer Prime, I said carefully. I'm not a xenobiologist. I wouldn't be qualified to assess the validity of the scientific data. That's not what I'm asking. I thought about it for a moment. In my experience, humans had a tendency to be very creative with the truth when it served their purposes, but they also had a tendency to be surprisingly straightforward about things that mattered to them. I think, I said finally, that Dr. Vasquez genuinely believes she's protecting something important. Whether that something is exactly what she described, well, I suppose we'll find out over the next 20 years. Keth'var's mechanical appendages clicked thoughtfully. Humans are difficult to predict. Yes, they are. They don't seem to understand proper diplomatic protocol. No, they don't. And yet they consistently achieve results that more experienced negotiators would envy. They do indeed. Keth'var was quiet for a long moment. Keth'var, in your professional opinion, what makes humans so effective at this sort of negotiation? I thought about Commander Brooks and his asteroid mining operations, about Dr. Vasquez and her space-dwelling organisms, about all the other human negotiators I'd encountered over the past few cycles. I think, I said slowly, it's because they don't negotiate like diplomats. They negotiate like people who are personally invested in the outcome. I don't understand the distinction. When most species engage in diplomatic negotiations, they're representing abstract interests, territorial claims, trade agreements, legal precedents. The individual negotiators may care about achieving their objectives, but they're not personally affected by the outcome. And humans are different? Humans don't seem to be capable of treating negotiations as abstract exercises. When Dr. Vasquez was arguing for protecting those organisms, she wasn't just representing human scientific interests. She was personally committed to preventing what she saw as the destruction of something unique and valuable. And that makes them more effective? It makes them more motivated. When you're negotiating with someone who's personally invested in the outcome, someone who genuinely cares about what happens, you can't just rely on legal precedents and procedural advantages. You have to actually address their concerns. Keth'var nodded slowly. And if their concerns are legitimate? Then you end up with agreements that actually solve problems instead of just postponing conflicts. As the Vorthan delegation departed, I found myself alone with Dr. Vasquez in the observation lounge. She was staring out at the stars with the expression of quiet satisfaction, like someone who had just completed a particularly challenging puzzle. Dr. Vasquez, I said, I have to ask, those space-dwelling organisms you described, how much of that was actual scientific observation and how much was creative extrapolation? She turned to look at me, and her expression was completely serious. Keth'var, every single piece of data I presented was completely accurate. We have identified multiple species of organisms that appear to live and reproduce in the vacuum of space. We have documented complex behaviors that suggest intelligence. And we absolutely have evidence of ecosystem interactions that have never been observed anywhere else in the galaxy. So it was all real? It was all real, she confirmed. What I may have emphasized was the timeline for completing our research, the likelihood that the organisms are actually intelligent, and the potential legal complications that mining operations might face. Emphasized how? Dr. Vasquez smiled that unsettling human smile. Well, let's just say that the environmental impact assessment process could take anywhere from 5 to 30 years, depending on how thoroughly the Vorthons want to document their compliance with regulations. And the protected species classifications? Could be fast-tracked if we had sufficient evidence of intelligence, or could take decades if the evidence remains ambiguous. And the organisms might not actually be intelligent? They might not be. On the other hand, they might be. And the only way to find out for certain is to conduct the kind of comprehensive research that we're now going to be able to afford thanks to Vorthon funding. I stared at her. You turned scientific uncertainty into a negotiating advantage. I presented accurate information about the potential risks and benefits of different courses of action, she corrected. The fact that uncertainty favored our position was just fortunate. Dr. Vasquez, that's not how diplomatic negotiations are supposed to work. Isn't it? She asked. I thought the goal was to find solutions that leave everyone better off than they were before. Well, yes, but the Vorthons get access to potentially revolutionary mining techniques and exclusive rights to mineral extraction in a system that they weren't actually using anyway. We get funding for research that could lead to major scientific breakthroughs and protection for ecosystems that might be unique in the galaxy. And if the organisms turn out not to be intelligent, then the Vorthons get their mining rights back, plus 20 years' worth of scientific data about how to extract minerals without environmental damage. And we get 20 years to study one of the most interesting ecosystems ever discovered. She shrugged. Either way, everyone wins. I realized that I was once again watching a human take what should have been an impossible situation and turn it into an outcome that was better for everyone involved than what they'd started with. Dr. Vasquez, I said, can I ask you a personal question? Sure. Do you actually believe those organisms are intelligent? She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the stars. Keth'var, she said finally. 20 years ago, the galaxy thought humans weren't intelligent enough to be worth worrying about. 50 years ago, they didn't even know we existed. Intelligence isn't always obvious, especially when you're dealing with something that evolved under completely different conditions than anything you've encountered before. So yes, I think there's a very good chance that at least some of those organisms are intelligent. But even if they're not, they're still worth protecting and studying. And if the Vorthons had insisted on proceeding with their mining operations? Dr. Vasquez's expression hardened slightly. Then we would have had to consider other options. Such as? Well, hypothetically speaking, if mining operations were to accidentally damage our research satellites, it might take quite a while to replace them. And without our satellites, it would be very difficult to navigate safely through the asteroid belt. You're talking about sabotage. I'm talking about the unfortunate consequences of conducting complex industrial operations in a system where the only detailed navigation data is controlled by people who really don't want you to be there. I felt that familiar chill. Dr. Vasquez, you're a xenobotanist. You study plants. I study organisms that survive in environments that would kill most known life forms, she corrected. You'd be amazed what you can learn about survival from things that live in hard vacuum and feed on solar radiation. For instance, they've taught me that sometimes the best way to protect something fragile is to make sure that damaging it would be more trouble than leaving it alone. As I write this report, 3 cycles after my first encounter with humans, I've come to several conclusions about our newest galactic neighbors. First, they are absolutely nothing like what we expected. The academic profile suggested a species that was young, primitive, and largely harmless. The reality is a species that treats every challenge as a creative problem-solving exercise and has no apparent understanding of the concept impossible. Second, they don't think like any other species I've encountered. Where most of us see established procedures and legal precedents, they see opportunities for creative reinterpretation. Where we see overwhelming disadvantages, they see angles that nobody else has considered. Where we see obvious solutions, They see ways to turn the problem around until it solves itself. Third, they are genuinely committed to peaceful coexistence, but their definition of peaceful includes options that most species wouldn't consider until they were already at war. They prefer diplomacy to violence, but they've redefined diplomacy to include psychological warfare, creative legal interpretation, and strategic unpredictability. Fourth, they are going to fundamentally change how galactic politics work, whether we're ready for it or not. Traditional diplomatic protocols were designed for species that shared certain basic assumptions about how negotiations should proceed. Humans don't share those assumptions, and they're not particularly interested in learning them. But here's the thing that I think my colleagues in the diplomatic corps are missing. This might actually be a good thing. For millennia, galactic politics has been dominated by established powers using traditional methods to maintain existing hierarchies. Disputes were resolved based on precedent, military strength, and economic leverage. The strong got what they wanted, the weak accepted what they could get, and everyone agreed that this was the natural order of things. Humans have been part of galactic society for less than 50 years, and they've already demonstrated that the natural order is more flexible than anyone imagined. They've shown that being militarily weak doesn't mean being helpless, that being economically disadvantaged doesn't mean being powerless, and that being new to galactic politics doesn't mean accepting whatever terms the established powers choose to offer. More importantly, they've done all of this without actually starting any wars. They've deterred aggression, protected their interests, and achieved their objectives. But they've done it through negotiation rather than conquest. They've been creative, unpredictable, and occasionally terrifying, but they haven't been destructive. In fact, in every case I've observed, human negotiating tactics have ultimately led to agreements that left all parties better off than they were before. They don't just win conflicts, they find ways to turn conflicts into opportunities for mutual benefit. Which brings me to my final conclusion. We need to learn from them. The Galactic Council has spent thousands of years developing sophisticated diplomatic protocols designed to prevent wars between established powers. But those protocols were never designed to handle the kind of rapid change that we're seeing as new species join galactic society. Humans have shown us that diplomatic innovation is possible, that traditional methods aren't the only way to resolve conflicts, and that sometimes the best solution to a problem is to refuse to accept that the problem exists in the first place. They've also shown us that fear can be a powerful diplomatic tool, but only if it's used correctly. The goal isn't to make your opponents afraid of you. It's to make them afraid of the consequences of not negotiating seriously with you. And perhaps most importantly, they've demonstrated that personal investment in outcomes leads to better agreements than abstract representation of interests. When negotiators genuinely care about what happens, they're more motivated to find creative solutions, and more willing to take risks to achieve them. I've submitted a formal recommendation to the Diplomatic Corps suggesting that we establish an exchange program with human diplomatic services. Not because we need to learn their specific tactics. Most of them wouldn't work for species that aren't inherently unpredictable. But because we need to learn their approach to creative problem solving. We need to learn how to see opportunities where we've always seen obstacles, how to turn disadvantages into advantages, and how to negotiate from a position of strength even when we don't have conventional forms of power. Most importantly, we need to learn how to care about outcomes rather than just procedures, how to focus on solving problems rather than just following protocols. Because if humans have taught me anything over these past 3 cycles, it's that the most dangerous thing you can do in negotiations is to underestimate someone who has more to lose than you do, and more creativity than you expect. And the most valuable thing you can do is to make sure that you're on the same side as that someone, rather than on the opposite side. The galaxy is changing, whether we're ready for it or not. The question isn't whether we can stop that change, it's whether we can adapt to it quickly enough to benefit from the opportunities it creates. And if we're smart, we'll learn from the species that's been adapting to impossible situations for their entire evolutionary history. After all, if humans have proven anything, it's that being new to the game doesn't mean you can't change the rules. You just have to be creative enough to figure out which rules actually matter, and which ones are just suggestions that everyone has been too polite to ignore. End of report. Keth'var, of the 3rd Spiral Senior Communications Officer, Galactic Diplomatic Corps, Stardate 2387.156. Personal note. Commander Brooks was right about one thing. Humans are very, very good at surviving. What he didn't mention is that they're also very good at making sure their friends survive too. In a galaxy full of species that view diplomacy as a zero-sum game, that might be their most important contribution of all. So there I was, minding my own business on what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic mission to the Terran colony of New Brisbane. Yeah, they named it after some old Earth city. Because humans have all the creativity of a broken translation matrix when it comes to naming things. I'm Vexthak of the third spiral, by the way, which translates roughly to, he who questions the wisdom of taking this job in Standard Galactic. Fitting, really. The whole thing started because someone in the Confederation Council thought it would be brilliant to send me, a mid-level bureaucrat with the social skills of a malfunctioning food processor, to negotiate a mining rights agreement with the humans. Apparently, my species' natural ability to detect mineral deposits through our cranial sensors made me the obvious choice. Right. Because nothing could possibly go wrong when you send someone who's never been within 3 parsecs of human space to deal with the most unpredictable species in the known galaxy. I should have known things were going sideways the moment I stepped off the transport shuttle. The human who greeted me, some guy named Lieutenant Commander Briggs, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the universe. His smile had that particular quality that screamed, "I'm being paid to pretend I'm happy to see you." "Welcome to New Brisbane, Ambassador Vexthak," he said, butchering my name in a way that would make my ancestors weep. "We've prepared quarters for you in the diplomatic sector." The diplomatic sector, as it turned out, was a converted storage facility that smelled like industrial lubricant and disappointment. But hey, at least they'd remembered to install atmosphere controls. Progress, right? The first few days went about as well as you'd expect. The humans were polite enough, but there was this underlying tension that I couldn't quite pin down. Every time I mentioned the mineral survey data, they'd exchange these looks. You know the kind, the ones that say, "We know something you don't, and you're not going to like it." It wasn't until day 4 that everything went to hell in a thoroughly human fashion. I was reviewing geological reports in my quarters when the emergency klaxon started blaring. Now, I've been around long enough to know that when humans start their warning systems, you should probably pay attention. These are the same beings who once declared war on their own planet's weather patterns and somehow won. Briggs burst through my door without bothering to knock. Because why would humans respect basic diplomatic protocol? And his face had gone that particular shade of pale that humans get when they're about to deliver bad news. "We've got a problem," he said, which in human parlance means, we're all probably going to die horribly. "What kind of problem?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. "The kind with massive xenophobic raiders, superior firepower, and a really bad attitude toward non-humans," he replied, confirming my suspicions. "The hegemony found us." "Ah, the hegemony. Lovely bunch, if your idea of lovely includes systematic genocide, aggressive expansionism, and a fashion sense that somehow made military uniforms look even more intimidating. They'd been carving a path through the Outer Rim territories for the better part of a decade, and apparently, they'd finally decided that New Brisbane looked like a nice place to add to their collection. "How long until they arrive?" I managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. 6 hours, maybe 7 if we're lucky. Briggs ran a hand through his hair in that distinctly human gesture of frustration. "Look, Ambassador, I'm going to be straight with you. We've got maybe 3,000 colonists here, and our defensive capabilities are, well, let's just say they're optimized for mining operations, not repelling invasion forces." This was it. This was how I was going to die, not in some glorious diplomatic triumph, but as collateral damage in a backwater colony that most of the galaxy had probably never heard of. I could already see the memorial inscription. "Here lies Vexthak, who died because someone thought it would be fun to send him to negotiate with humans." But then something strange happened. Instead of panic, instead of the chaos I expected, the humans did something that still makes my cranial sensors ache when I think about it. They got organized. Not the kind of organized you see in military dramas, with lots of shouting and dramatic music. No, this was the quiet, methodical kind of organized that humans do when they've decided that reality is being unreasonable and needs to be corrected. Within an hour, every civilian had been moved to reinforced shelters. The mining equipment had been repurposed into defensive positions. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Lieutenant Commander Briggs had apparently decided that keeping me alive was his personal mission. "You're coming with me," he said, appearing at my door again with a look that brooked no argument. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, though I was already following him down the corridor. Say what you want about humans, but when they get that determined look in their eyes, you don't argue. You just hang on and hope you survive whatever insane plan they've cooked up. "Command Center," he replied. "If we're going down fighting. And you might be able to help." The command center turned out to be a converted conference room with more jury-rigged equipment than a salvage yard. But the humans had made it work, because of course they had. Humans have this annoying habit of making things work regardless of whether they should theoretically be able to. The situation reports weren't encouraging. The hegemony fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers, 36 destroyers, and enough fighter craft to blot out the local star. New Brisbane's defenses consisted of 6 mining platforms with improvised weapons, a handful of atmospheric fighters, and approximately 3,000 very determined humans. In any reasonable universe, this would be called a massacre waiting to happen. But then Captain Morrison, Briggs's superior, and apparently the kind of human who eats impossible odds for breakfast, did something that redefined my understanding of the word audacious. "All right, people," she announced to the room. "We're not going to win this with conventional tactics. Hell, we're not going to win this with unconventional tactics either. So we're going to have to get creative." What followed was the most insane military briefing I'd ever witnessed. The humans laid out a plan that involved using the colony's industrial fabricators to create improvised weapons, turning the asteroid mining charges into proximity mines, and, this is the part that made my species equivalent of blood pressure spike, using me as bait. "The mineral sensors in your cranial structure," Morrison explained. "They can detect metallic composition at range, right?" I nodded, wondering where this was going and already suspecting I wouldn't like it. "Good, because we're going to need someone who can identify the weakest structural points on those hegemony ships. Real-time targeting data for our improvised weapons. You want me to sit in a combat zone and perform geological surveys on enemy warships?" I asked, just to make sure I was understanding the scope of their insanity correctly. "Pretty much," Briggs said with a grin that was probably meant to be reassuring but mostly just looked manic. "Don't worry, we'll keep you safe." "Right, because humans have such a stellar track record when it comes to keeping things safe. But here's the thing about humans, and this is something most of the galaxy doesn't really understand. They don't just ask you to risk your life for them. They risk theirs for you first. Over the next 4 hours, I watched 3,000 colonists work with the kind of focused determination that most species reserve for religious experiences. They weren't soldiers, most of them. They were miners, engineers, farmers, shopkeepers, regular people who'd signed up for a quiet life on the frontier and suddenly found themselves preparing to fight one of the most ruthless military forces in known space. And every single one of them went out of their way to make sure I was okay. The engineer who rigged my scanner interface to the targeting computer spent an extra hour making sure the neural feedback wouldn't cause me discomfort. The medic who checked my life support systems did a full health scan and offered me something for anxiety. Apparently humans have drugs for everything, including existential dread in the face of overwhelming odds. Hell, even the guy manning the mess hall brought me something to eat that was actually compatible with my species' dietary requirements. It tasted like cardboard mixed with synthetic nutrients, but the thought was there. By the time the hegemony fleet dropped out of hyperspace, I'd made a decision that probably violated about 17 different diplomatic protocols. I was going to help these insane, impossible, wonderful humans fight. The battle began exactly as you'd expect a battle between 3,000 colonists and a professional invasion fleet to begin, with the humans getting their collective asses kicked. The hegemony's opening salvo took out 2 of the mining platforms and half the atmospheric fighters. Their ground forces landed in 3 waves, establishing beachheads on the colony's perimeter with the kind of clinical precision that spoke to centuries of practice at this sort of thing. From the command center, I watched the tactical displays with a growing sense of doom. The humans were fighting bravely, but bravery doesn't stop plasma cannons or deflect orbital bombardment. "All right, Ambassador," Morrison said, her voice steady despite the fact that her colony was being systematically destroyed around her. "Time to earn your keep. We need targeting data on that lead cruiser." I activated my scanners and focused on the massive hegemony warship hanging in orbit like a metallic monument to aggressive foreign policy. What I found made my cranial sensors practically vibrate with excitement. "Captain," I said, trying to keep the disbelief out of my voice. "That ship has a structural weakness. The hegemony builds their vessels with redundant armor plating, but the mounting points for the heavy weapons create stress fractures in the hull. Can you pinpoint the exact locations?" "Give me 30 seconds. Those 30 seconds felt like 30 years, but when I finished my scan, I had something that made Morrison's eyes light up with predatory satisfaction. "Perfect," she said, keying her comm system. "All units, this is command. We have targeting data for a precision strike on the flagship. Coordinates incoming." What happened next was the kind of thing that makes humans simultaneously the most terrifying and most admirable species in the galaxy. Instead of trying to penetrate the cruiser's armor with their improvised weapons, they used the mining charges they'd converted into mines to create a debris field around the ship. Then, they used the precise targeting data I'd provided to hit the stress points with coordinated strikes from every remaining platform. The result was, well, Let's just say that watching a kilometer-long warship tear itself apart from structural failure is the kind of sight that stays with you. But the humans weren't done. Oh no, they were just getting started. While the hegemony fleet was dealing with the sudden loss of their flagship, the colonists launched Phase 2 of their plan. They'd been using the colony's industrial fabricators to create what they called surprise packages. Basically, anything that could explode, emit radiation, or otherwise cause problems for heavily armored space marines. The ground battle turned into the kind of chaotic mess that humans seem to thrive in. The hegemony forces, trained for conventional warfare, found themselves dealing with mining equipment used as improvised tanks, construction robots reprogrammed for combat, and humans who apparently thought that tactical retreat was just a suggestion. I spent the next 6 hours providing targeting data for increasingly creative applications of mining technology. Who knew that asteroid boring equipment could be so effective against powered armor? But the moment that really stuck with me, the moment that made me understand something fundamental about humans, came during the final phase of the battle. The hegemony had managed to break through the perimeter defenses and was making a push toward the command center. Their shock troops were advancing through the industrial sector, and it looked like the colonists' desperate defense was finally about to crumble. That's when Lieutenant Commander Briggs did something that still makes my species' equivalent of hair stand on end. He grabbed a plasma cutter from the mining equipment and charged directly at a squad of hegemony heavy infantry. Not tactically, not as part of some clever plan. He just decided that these particular aliens were not going to hurt the people he was responsible for protecting, and did something about it. The fact that he survived the encounter had less to do with tactical brilliance, and more to do with the hegemony troops being so shocked by his complete disregard for self-preservation that they hesitated just long enough for the rest of his squad to flank them. But that wasn't even the crazy part. The crazy part was what he said to me afterward, when the medics were patching up his numerous plasma burns and everyone was trying to figure out if we'd actually won, or just delayed the inevitable. "Thanks for the help with the targeting data," he said, like I'd done him some minor favor instead of potentially saving his entire colony. "We couldn't have pulled this off without you." That's when it hit me. These humans hadn't asked me to help them fight for their lives as some kind of diplomatic obligation. They genuinely wanted my assistance, and they were grateful for it in the same way they'd be grateful if I'd helped them move furniture or fix a broken piece of equipment. They treated acts of mutual survival as casually as most species treat small talk. The battle ended when the remaining hegemony ships, faced with the loss of their flagship and the complete disaster that their ground invasion had become, decided that New Brisbane wasn't worth the cost and withdrew to lick their wounds elsewhere. The humans, being humans, immediately started organizing relief efforts and damage assessments, while simultaneously planning a celebration for their unlikely victory. I should have left then. My diplomatic mission was obviously a write-off, and there were forms to file and reports to submit back at Confederation headquarters. But something made me stick around for a few more days. Maybe it was curiosity about how humans dealt with post-battle cleanup. Maybe it was professional interest in their improvised defensive technologies. Or maybe it was the fact that Lieutenant Commander Briggs had saved my life at least 3 times during the fighting, and I wanted to make sure he survived his injuries. What I discovered during those extra days changed my entire perspective on humanity's place in the galactic community. The humans didn't just rebuild their colony. They improved it. They took the lessons learned from the hegemony attack and redesigned their defenses, their infrastructure, even their civilian evacuation procedures. Within a week, New Brisbane was not just back to normal. It was better than it had been before the attack. But more than that, they remembered everything. Every person who'd contributed to the defense, every act of courage or creativity or simple stubborn refusal to give up. They kept track of it all, and they made sure everyone got recognized for their part in the victory, including me. Captain Morrison called me into her temporary office on my last day at the colony. The original command center had been destroyed during the final hegemony push, so she was working out of a converted storage shed that smelled like lubricant and determination. "Ambassador," she said, "I wanted to thank you personally for everything you did during the attack. Your targeting data made the difference between victory and massacre." I started to give the standard diplomatic response about interspecies cooperation and mutual benefit, but she held up a hand to stop me. "I'm not talking about the official stuff," she said. "I'm talking about the fact that you chose to stay and fight with us when you could have demanded evacuation. That meant something to my people." She handed me a small device that looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts. Which, knowing humans, it probably had been. "What is this?" I asked. "Emergency beacon," she replied. "Keyed to New Brisbane's communication array. If you're ever in trouble, anywhere in the galaxy, any time, you activate that beacon and we'll come running. I looked at the device, then at Morrison, then back at the device. Captain, I appreciate the gesture, but surely you realize that the chances of me needing emergency assistance from a frontier mining colony are— Doesn't matter, she interrupted. You stood with us when the chips were down. That makes you family, and humans don't abandon family. Family. She called me family. I've been in diplomatic service for most of my adult life. I've negotiated trade agreements, mediated territorial disputes, and sat through more ceremonial dinners than I care to remember. But no one had ever called me family. I took the beacon. 3 months later, I was on a routine inspection tour of Confederation research facilities when everything went sideways again. Because apparently, the universe has a sense of humor, and that sense of humor involves putting me in mortal danger at regular intervals. The research station I was visiting, Kepler Station, orbiting a gas giant in the Vega system, was attacked by pirates. Not the romantic, swashbuckling kind of pirates you see in entertainment holos, but the kind that view civilian casualties as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of whatever they can steal. The station's defenses were minimal. It was a research facility, not a military installation. The security forces were overwhelmed within minutes, and the pirates began systematically looting the place while taking hostages to ensure compliance. I found myself locked in a storage compartment with a dozen other survivors, listening to the sounds of the station being torn apart around us. The pirates were being thorough, and it was only a matter of time before they found our hiding spot. That's when I remembered the beacon. I pulled the device out of my diplomatic pouch and stared at it. Morrison's words echoed in my memory. If you're ever in trouble, anywhere in the galaxy, anytime, you activate that beacon and we'll come running. But Kepler Station was 14 parsecs from New Brisbane. Even if the humans received the signal immediately, it would take days for any kind of rescue force to reach us. The pirates would be long gone, probably with us as hostages to be sold on some outer rim slave market. Still, what choice did I have? I activated the beacon. The response came faster than I'd expected. Not a rescue force, but a voice transmission on a secure channel that somehow bypassed the pirates' jamming. Ambassador Vexthak, this is New Brisbane Command. We've received your distress signal. Hang tight, help is on the way. Help was on the way. 14 parsecs away and help was on the way. I started to ask how they could possibly mount a rescue operation across that distance, but the transmission cut out before I could form the question. What happened next is the kind of thing that makes perfect sense if you understand humans, and absolutely no sense if you don't. The pirates had just finished looting the station's main laboratory when every communication channel on Kepler Station simultaneously activated with the same message. Attention pirate vessels, this is the Terran Colonial Defense Network. You are currently holding Ambassador Vexthak of the Confederation, who is under the protection of New Brisbane Colony. You have 10 minutes to release all hostages and withdraw from the system. The pirate captain, a particularly unpleasant regalian named something I couldn't pronounce, responded with the kind of profanity-laced tirade you'd expect from someone whose day job involves robbing research stations. 10 minutes, the transmission repeated. After that, we stopped being polite. Now here's where it gets interesting. The pirates had done their homework before attacking Kepler Station. They knew it was lightly defended, they knew the response time for Confederation security forces, and they knew there were no military installations within rapid deployment range. What they didn't know was that humans have a very flexible definition of rapid deployment range. At the 9-minute mark, 3 objects dropped out of hyperspace near the gas giant. They weren't ships exactly, more like heavily armed cargo containers with engines strapped to them. The kind of things you'd build if you needed to get from point A to point B quickly and didn't particularly care about aesthetics or crew comfort. The lead container broadcast a message to the pirate ships. This is Strike Package Alpha, New Brisbane Colonial Defense. You now have 1 minute to comply with previous demands. The pirate captain made the mistake of treating this like a negotiation. Big mistake. Strike Package. Alpha turned out to be 3 of New Brisbane's mining ships, hastily converted into what humans apparently call armed merchant cruisers. They'd stripped out the mining equipment, installed military-grade weapon systems, and somehow managed to make the 14-parsec jump in less than 4 hours. The technical specifications of how they managed that journey are classified, but I suspect it involved the kind of creative engineering that humans are famous for, and that makes safety inspectors wake up in cold sweats. The pirates, faced with 3 ships that shouldn't have been able to exist, let alone function, made their second mistake of the day. They decided to fight. What followed was less a space battle and more a practical demonstration of why you should never underestimate human creativity when it comes to violence. The converted mining ships used their original equipment, now repurposed as weapons, to systematically dismantle the pirate vessels. Industrial cutting lasers, it turns out, are quite effective against starship hulls when applied with sufficient enthusiasm. The boarding action was even more educational. The human Marines who came aboard Kepler Station weren't professional soldiers. They were the same miners, engineers, and colonists who'd fought off the hegemony attack. But they'd had 3 months to think about that battle, and they'd spent that time getting very creative about personal combat techniques. The pirates surrendered after 15 minutes of trying to fight humans who treated zero-gravity combat like a particularly energetic recreational activity. But the real surprise came after the fighting was over, when Lieutenant Commander Briggs, now apparently sporting the rank of commander and a collection of interesting scars, found me in the storage compartment where I'd been hiding. "Sorry we're late," he said, like he was apologizing for missing a dinner appointment. "Traffic was murder coming through the hyperspace lanes." "How?" I managed to ask. "How did you get here so fast?" Briggs grinned, that manic human grin I'd come to know and dread. "Oh, that. Well, after the hegemony thing, we figured it would be a good idea to have some rapid response capability. So we've been working on a few projects." A few projects. They'd spent 3 months secretly developing the ability to deploy military forces across interstellar distances in a matter of hours. And they called it a few projects. "The beacon you gave me," I said. "How many people have them?" "Just you so far," he replied. "But we're working on expanding the program. Turns out there are quite a few folks out there who could use some backup when things go sideways." That's when I realized what the humans had done. They hadn't just built a defense network for their own colony. They'd created a rapid response system for anyone they considered worth protecting, anyone they considered family. The trip back to New Brisbane gave me time to think about everything that had happened. The humans had risked their lives to save me, not because of any diplomatic obligation or interspecies treaty, but because I'd stood with them during their own crisis. They'd remembered a favor, and they'd repaid it in the most human way possible, by completely redefining what was theoretically feasible. When we reached New Brisbane, I found a colony that had been transformed. The mining operations were still there, but they'd been integrated into a defensive network that looked like something out of a military engineering textbook. The population had grown to nearly 5,000, mostly refugees from hegemony attacks who'd heard about the colony that had successfully fought off an invasion fleet. But the most significant change was in the orbital infrastructure. New Brisbane now boasted a shipyard that was busy turning out more of those improvised warships, and a communication array that could reach across half the galaxy in real time. Captain Morrison, now promoted to Admiral Morrison because apparently saving your entire colony from annihilation gets you noticed by higher-ups, met me at the spaceport. "Welcome back, Ambassador," she said. "I trust your rescue was satisfactory?" "More than satisfactory," I replied. "Though I have to ask, how many people know about your rapid response capability?" "Officially, nobody. Unofficially?" She shrugged in that casual human way. "Word gets around. We've had quite a few requests for those emergency beacons lately. And you're just giving them out?" "To the right people, sure. Folks who've proven they're willing to stand up when it matters. Folks who understand that sometimes you have to fight for what's worth preserving." That evening, at the celebration dinner, they insisted on throwing for my safe return. I sat surrounded by humans who treated my survival as a personal victory. They told stories about the rescue mission like it had been a fun weekend project, and they planned future improvements to their rapid response system with the same enthusiasm most species reserve for discussing the weather. Commander Briggs found me during the festivities, when I was standing on the observation deck looking out at the shipyard where more impossible vessels were taking shape. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, which is apparently a human idiom that means something like, "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm trying to understand," I said. "This whole system you've built. The ships, the communication network, the response capability. It must have cost enormous resources. And you're using it to help people who can't offer you anything in return." "Can't they?" Briggs asked. "You helped us fight off the hegemony." "That doctor we pulled out of the Regalian system last month? She's working on new medical treatments for radiation exposure. The engineer we rescued from those slavers? He's designed improvements to our ship navigation systems. So it's not altruism," I said. "It's an investment strategy." Briggs laughed, which made his facial scars bunch up in interesting ways. "Maybe. Or maybe we've just figured out that the galaxy is a dangerous place, and it's better to have friends who'll watch your back than enemies who'll stab it." "And if someone can't contribute anything useful? Then we help them anyway," he said, with the kind of matter-of-fact certainty that makes humans simultaneously frustrating and admirable, because that's what you do for family. 6 months later, I submitted my final report on the New Brisbane mining rights negotiation to the Confederation Council. It was the longest diplomatic report in the organization's history, and it recommended immediate approval of all human requests, along with a formal alliance agreement and technology sharing protocols. The Council approved the recommendations unanimously. They also offered me a promotion to Senior Ambassador and a permanent posting to coordinate Human Confederation relations. I accepted, of course. Someone needs to keep an eye on the humans, and I've discovered that the job comes with some unexpected benefits. Like the emergency beacon that now sits in my desk drawer, ready to summon impossible rescue ships crewed by miners who think that physics is more of a suggestion than a law. Like the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy there are 3,000 humans who consider me family. And like the growing certainty that the next time someone threatens something the humans care about, they're going to discover that humanity doesn't just remember favors. They remember everything. And they repay it all, one impossible rescue at a time. Epilogue. The final entry in Ambassador Vexthak's personal log, dated 3 years after the events at New Brisbane. The Human Colonial Defense Network now operates 47 rapid response vessels across 16 sectors. They've successfully completed over 200 rescue operations, defended dozens of colonies from various threats, and somehow managed to turn their entire expansion into one giant mutual aid society. The hegemony, incidentally, has stopped expanding into human-adjacent territories. Apparently, the prospect of fighting an enemy that treats military logistics as a creative challenge has dampened their enthusiasm for conquest. Last week I received my 5th emergency beacon. This one is programmed to summon what humans call the Heavy Response Package. I'm told it involves ships with names like Regrettable Decision and Diplomatic Incident, which tells you everything you need to know about human naming conventions and tactical philosophy. I keep all 5 beacons in my office now, arranged on a shelf where visiting diplomats can see them. They serve as an excellent reminder that some species take friendship very, very seriously. And if anyone ever doubts the wisdom of treating humans as allies rather than enemies, I tell them about New Brisbane. About 3,000 colonists who looked at impossible odds and decided that impossible was just another word for, we haven't figured out how yet. Because that's the thing about humans. They don't just remember favors. They remember everything. And they have very creative ideas about how to return the favor.